wants to have a look. Okay, now we've stopped my slides. The project actually expanded something way beyond what I thought it was going to be. When I started drilling into those 50 words in the actual article, I'm not going to talk about everything that we covered because we dealt with everything from drug use among children to production side stuff, which is why we went way beyond the word count the publishers wanted. I'm going to just focus on the 2 words that are in my title, which is appropriate measures. The reason I do that is because it frames the rest of it. I think you've got an important qualifier there and something you can build a legal test around, which I'll get to towards the end. Because without that qualifier, the rest of it can be used to justify just about anything, as I think Rick alluded to. The question is what measures are appropriate to protect children from drugs and to prevent their use in the drug trade. There are any number of other questions to be raised in here, and the study that I've done is really a conversation starter. It doesn't deal with any of this comprehensively or definitively. Issues like what's the connection between the relevant international treaties and the Convention on the Rights of the Child? At the time, they were really just talking about the 61 and 71 drugs treaties, but since then, you've got the 88 trafficking one. You've got the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which I think changes the dynamic significantly. I talk about that a bit in this book, but I think there's a lot more work to be done, especially given the fact that the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control explicitly connects itself to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So let's look at the issue of parents. I've chosen some rather egregious examples here to illustrate the point. On the top right of the picture, that is a protest about the execution of Sally Ordinario Villanueva last year. She was a mother of 3 from the Philippines who was executed in China for drug offenses. The woman on the top left, coincidentally, is also from the Philippines, and she's in a Brazilian prison for drug trafficking. She did that out of poverty, no other options, but she's a mother of 5. And even when she finishes her sentence, she won't be able to afford the ticket to go home. This is the issue of drug mules, of course, that everyone's probably heard of. And on the top right, Rick already mentioned the death penalty. I would invite everybody, by the way, it's just come out. The Quakers UN office has just done a great little booklet on children of parents on death row and children of parents who've been executed. It's an issue I really haven't seen people taking up enough. And on the bottom, I don't know, has anyone heard of Project Prevention? Have you ever heard of this? So Project Prevention has been going since the 90s in the United States and offers drug users $200-300 to be sterilized or to undergo long-term contraception. The reason being, the woman who runs this, and this is a quote, she says that, or a paraphrase, but it's next to a quote, that, we spay and neuter dogs, so, these women are dropping babies like litters, so we need to do something about it. Now, she's adopted 4 children herself from a woman who was using crack, but there are many ethical and human rights, and I think child rights issues with this. So the question for me is, how do you take into account the best interests of the child and children's rights when sentencing primary caregivers or mothers in particular? Given that in that same prison where that woman on the top left is, there are many children, because there's nowhere else to go except into prison with your mother. Similarly, around questions around sentencing in terms of the death penalty. And the question on the bottom is just an egregious example of the very sensitive issue of parents who are drug dependent. What is an appropriate measure to deal with that? Because there's no doubt that there's significant risk to children around alcohol and drug dependency related to parenting, no doubt. The question is, what's an appropriate thing to do about it? And trying to prevent those children from ever being born seems like a massive waste of time and a seriously ethical minefield you're getting yourself into. There are many other things that can be done there. There's drug liaison midwives for people who are using drugs and they're pregnant. There are opioid substitution programs to try and stabilize people and to make them a little bit safer than using street-bought heroin and so on. There's any number of things that can be done. Focus social work, there's an excellent pilot program that's been going on in Wales for some time. This brings us to the question of appropriate measures. What about schools? On the left there, I'm sorry to say that's me published in the Daily Mail, but someone had published a commentary calling for sniffer dogs and random drug testing in schools. And I just thought, even a right-wing paper will understand that you don't want your children being randomly tested and pulled into the criminal justice system and the treatment system and being branded a drug user just because they might have tried a joint. I don't think even the most cautious of parents wants that for their child. But random school drug testing, I might talk about again later on. When I talk about evidence and the concept in law that we all know of arbitrariness. Because not only is there no evidence to support this, in fact, the evidence suggests it doesn't work. There isn't even a workable theory as to why it might possibly work to help kids or to stop other kids using. No one's ever set that out. Someone just thought this is a great idea, I think I'll try it. What you will do is increase truancy and decrease trust between your students and the teachers, which actually does decrease drug use and early pregnancies. On the right is an armed school raid in the United States. We could talk about other things. Strip searching of children as parts of drug raids. If anyone studies US law, maybe the Savannah Redding case might pop to mind, where a girl was strip searched because someone told a teacher she was carrying ibuprofen, which of course is just a headache pill. So coming back to Rick's point about the International Narcotics Control Board, I'm going to talk about some different issues, but Rick mentioned this as a parallel treaty body between the drug control and human rights regime. I thought I'd compare what they've said to some of the things the Committee on the Rights of the Child has said on the same topics, right? So here we have Mexico. On the left, you've got a peace march. On the right, you've got an orphan child. You can do a search on Google if you want for any number of gory images from Mexico. I thought I'd save us all that. The top is one of a number of either unqualified or supportive statements the INCB has made for what Mexico has done. Now, I've been in meetings with Mexican politicians, and at this point, you can only sympathize with the situation they're in. This is. I think everybody recognizes that launching tens of thousands of troops to fight the cartels was an enormous and catastrophic mistake, but how you reverse it is very, very difficult. But you would expect, perhaps at least, the treaty body for the drug conventions, which of course is the justification for doing this in the first place, to possibly say, look, we recognize there was a problem there. No, instead we get this being referred to as decisive measures to address the drug problems. The year previously, they called it the Mexican government's tremendous efforts. And they do mention the body count, but they don't say anything bad about it. The Committee on the Rights of the Child, in its review of the optional protocol on children in armed conflict, was very concerned about this because at least 1,000 children have been killed at this point in this. And children under the age of 18 have been used to fight the cartels as part of the military, which the Committee on the Rights of the Child was also not impressed with. The man on the right is Professor Hunt's successor as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health. That's Anand Grover. And on the left is a picture from a Vietnam drug detention center. Now, this is the quote that Rick was talking about when the INCB supported Vietnam. This did follow, by the way, the INCB's mission to Vietnam. They went there and saw this and came back and still had nothing to say. The committee has addressed the same topic in relation to Cambodia in 2010, and they recognized that this was arbitrary detention of children and abuse of children, and that these centers should be closed down and the children released. The INCB has yet to take a position, as Rick mentioned. And this, as you might recognize, is an airplane spraying glyphosate, or what the Monsanto would call Roundup, its chemical, on coca fields in Colombia. Here's the INCB urging the government of Colombia and others, but Colombia is the only place where this happens at the moment, anywhere in the world, to step up its measures. So without any criticism of aerial fumigation, which has, by the way, contributed to human displacement, it does contribute to health concerns when you connect the chemical that we're talking about here with the other chemicals necessary to attach it to plants, the surfactants they call them. It has had health concerns. In fact, Professor Hunt was in Ecuador, I believe, in 2007, and I'm not sure if that report has yet been published about that visit. Ecuador is now suing Colombia at the International Court of Justice about this, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2006 criticized Colombia for it and said that they should conduct a child rights impact assessment of it. Recently, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has said something similar. UN Development Programme has also criticized this. We could also mention the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights as well, who's also been against it. The INCB asks, without commentary, that this be stepped up. So it leads me to getting past the kind of the problems and what I wanted to do in the book was to if it says appropriate measures in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, then what would we mean by it? The phrase props up elsewhere in the context of violence against children or child abuse and neglect. Similar wording, take all appropriate measures to protect children. But of course, violence against children and drugs are qualitatively different things. Children using drugs, for example, is a category of risk or vulnerability for those children. Violence against children is a direct abuse against them. So while the Committee on the Rights of the Child has said in their recent general comment that appropriate measures in the context of Article 19 can't be read to justify any form of violence against children, can you say the same thing in relation to under 18s who use drugs? Could you say that? And what if your measures lead to violence and a violation of Article 19 in the first place? So I think the words might mean different things in Article 19 than what they mean in Article 33. So looking at it in a normative context, this is what I came up with, at least to start off the debate. The first is that whatever measure you take should be read in the light of the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a whole. You can't take this thing out of context. I think that's standard reading of an international treaty. Secondly, I think you need to take into account other laws, and this is brought in by Article 41 of the Convention, unless I'm making a horrible mistake, more conducive to the realization of the rights of the child. Now that's really interesting. I had Brazil at the start. Now Brazil's got great national legislation on children's rights. It doesn't necessarily translate into that on the ground. It also brings in the question of using other international human rights instruments, such as the Convention Against Torture, for example, against drug detention centres. But it raises the question, are the drug conventions more conducive to the realization of the rights of the child in this context than the convention itself? Given that children barely arise in the context of the drug conventions, I don't think so. I think the child rights framework has more to say if you can drill down. I suggest that we need to focus on vulnerability or patterns of vulnerability, including socioeconomic status and in particular gender. There's a lot to that. Around the way girls in particular start using drugs, the connections between sex work and very problematic drug use and so on, and in relation to parenting. I would suggest, and this comes from our public health background, that your measures should be evidence-based. You don't want to undertake arbitrary measures that are just somebody's idea of what might work. Brings me back to that random school drug testing idea. Arbitrariness, I think, is something that's quite common to legal standards. I think we all know it. And my final one is that sometimes things are evidence-based but not necessarily appropriate or proportionate anyway. You can guarantee that somebody won't reoffend if you kill them. It's not a proportionate response. It's not an appropriate response. It's not a child rights-based response. So this is where I was starting from with that idea of what would be an appropriate measure. Now the thing is that could be a little bit vague still. I mean, I think a legitimate criticism of international human rights treaties is that they're a little bit nebulous to apply to very acute problems on the ground. So let's take one. This is where I said I'd follow Rick's trajectory. I'm going to end on a very similar picture to his, except these are children in Odessa a few years ago. After these pictures were taken, they disappeared. Nobody knows where any of them are. They're injecting a homemade drug. They basically call it Baltushka. It means it's a form of stimulant, but it's whatever they can get their hands on, really. A lot of them live in the sewers. They live in burnt-out buses. They live in the streets. There's tens of thousands of street children across Ukraine. The actual number isn't known. But what we do know is that the vast majority of boys under the age of 25 contract HIV through injecting drug use. Girls less so. But the connection between drug use and sex work among girls in the streets and elsewhere in Ukraine is stark. So, what's an appropriate measure to protect those children? Right, because at the moment what you'll have is, and this happens in other countries, it's a serious problem in Central and Eastern Europe, it's a serious problem in East Asia and South Asia. And there's very little in the way of guidelines around it, there's very little in the way of disaggregated data to even know the concept. And here we're getting into reading this in the context of the convention as a whole, because if we look at let's start with that. Let's start with the general principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is an easy way to get in. We've got non-discrimination, which requires disaggregated data in order to uncover those patterns of vulnerability that I talked about. Here, we don't know how many under 18s are doing this. We don't know their situation. We know very little about them. So there's a data collection imperative to study this and find out what's going on. We can look at something like, in other countries where this happens, it happens in the UK, right? in many countries, when you do have something where you can intervene in the immediacy of that risky activity, needle and syringe programs, right? It's very controversial to hand a clean needle to a child. And many countries will simply put an age restriction to not have to deal with that problem. In Sweden, the age is 20. In other countries, it's more around the age of majority, about 18. But the fact is that the age of initiation into the practice is often below that. So what you've got is a gap in protection. Now, the thing is, you can try and work with those children over time to try and get them off drugs, but you have to look at that in context. If you're street involved, no education, sometimes no parents and so on, this is a rational course of action for that kind of life. So, what does the Convention on the Rights of the Child say about an age restriction like that on those services? Let's look at that in the context of the best interests of the child. If you need to make a best interest assessment, you need to have some leeway for what to do. If you put an age restriction in the middle of the legislation, you've made an arbitrary decision from policymakers that's implemented on top of clinicians and service providers with no opportunity for the young person to have a voice. Article 12, the other general principle that I wanted to talk about. It doesn't take into account the child's evolving capacities, Article 5, such that a very young child might be responded to very differently from a 17-year-old, for example. And we can look at this in a more of a holistic way, right? There's one of the things that Professor Hunt said and that Noam said was the amount of different human rights that are touched upon, the amount of different issues that are touched upon. And to finish, I'll give an example from Ireland, where I'm from. A study was done in 2008 that looked at 86 under-19s using opiates. And they studied the various life situations of these young people upon entry into treatment. And what they found was, among many other issues around their health status, you know, people newly testing positive for hepatitis C and HIV and so on, they found that 44 of them had previous psychiatric contact. They'd been in touch with mental health services. Very few of them were living with their main families. Some of them had been homeless. Many of them had been in contact with the criminal justice system. And they were engaging many, many, many rights of the child and a protective framework around the issue. One of the things that really struck me was education. Of the 86, although the vast majority were of school age, because it's 18 and under in Ireland, only 5 were currently in school. And see, the thing is that the initial reaction there is, well, of course, if you're going to be using drugs, you're probably going to eventually find yourself outside of school. But over half of those initiated drug use after they left school, and in particular, being excluded from school, was a very risky factor. It was the one that really denoted whether children might possibly get into risky behaviours. It's actually something that's mirrored in HIV prevention. If you can keep kids in school, you can protect them. Brings me back to random school drug testing again, which has been shown to increase truancy. So what I've tried to do from here is to show that children are at the forefront of measures, justifications for drug control. Some of the issues that affect children, some of the vague mentions of children in the international system, the lack of any concrete work that's been done on it, and the scale of the work that still needs to be done, because this is just one issue on one street and one sewer in Odessa. And context is everything, because this is dealt with here in the UK in a very different way, and it can be dealt with in a very different way here in the UK because of that context. So there we have any number of theses just from what I've tried to say today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Damon. Thank you. And we now have some minutes for questions, discussion, comments. Who would like to start? We have a microphone here.
Just for recording purposes. If you were going to put the session on our website, if you do not wish to be on the website, just come and tell me afterwards, and we'll just not put the clip or the question.
Please, sir.
No, you can say something.
I'm Michel Mabo from Health and Human Sciences, first year PhD student. And I'm very happy to have listened to both presentations. But I'm a novice when it comes to this whole issue about drugs and human rights. But I have an experience which I want to share here. back in Cameroon, I teach students in health and allied health professions. And this academic year, I had a peculiar problem. For the first time, I had students in one of my classes who were smoking cannabis. It was an issue that we were aware of, but I was also aware that I couldn't expel these students from school based on that problem. And again, I was acutely aware that we had no structures to help this kind of students. I spoke with two of the students, and I found that I was not equipped to solve that problem. And so when I sat down and listened to these presentations, this issue came back to mind, because the question I asked myself is, if people are taking drugs, something pushes them to it. And what is that particular thing that pushes them to it? If we can find those problems, then maybe there will be other solutions to that than one of the things that was presented here as the death sentence or the death penalty. Now I ask the first question here, that what do governments do, what do societies do, and what do individuals in society do to prevent the use of drugs or the proliferation of drugs? Because I think that if a government has a right to take life because somebody trafficked or is involved in trafficking of drugs, that right should only come when the government has done everything possible to ensure that possible or predisposing factors to drug use and drug proliferation have been eliminated. So if a government or a society has not done that, I wonder why they should have the right to use the death penalty as one of the strategies to discourage the proliferation of drugs. Then the second observation from one of the conventions, I'm sorry I didn't get the particular one, but I have some words there. States should